Number 1. Sandy Hook Elementary School, Adam Lanza. It was a cold, quiet December morning in Newtown, Connecticut, the kind of morning built around familiar routines. School buses rolled through residential streets. Children stepped onto the pavement carrying backpacks, lunchboxes, and unfinished conversations. Teachers opened classroom doors and prepared for another ordinary Friday. Nothing about December 14th, 2012, appeared unusual. Yet before that morning was over, Sandy Hook Elementary School would become the site of one of the darkest tragedies in modern American history, and the name Adam Lanza would become inseparable from a national debate about school security, mental health, firearms, and warning signs that are often understood only after it is too late. Adam Lanza was 20 years old. Born in 1992, he grew up in Newtown and lived with his mother, Nancy Lanza, following his parents' divorce. People who encountered him at different stages of his life often described the same pattern. He was intelligent, intensely private, socially uncomfortable, and increasingly detached from the world around him. He attended several schools before finishing his education through alternative arrangements. Ordinary interaction appeared difficult for him. As the years passed, isolation became less of a preference and more like the structure of his entire existence. Nancy tried to provide stability for her son, managing his routines and adapting to his growing withdrawal. But inside their home, Adam's world continued shrinking. In his final years, he rarely ventured outside. He spent long periods alone and sometimes communicated with his mother through email even though they lived under the same roof. Investigators would later discover that he had devoted enormous attention to researching previous mass shootings, compiling information, and immersing himself in accounts of violence. There was no single document that clearly explained what he intended to do, but there was evidence of a mind becoming increasingly consumed by death, control, and detachment. Then came the morning of December 14th. Before driving to the school, Lanza killed his mother inside their home. He then took firearms that belonged to her, got into her vehicle, and headed towards Sandy Hook Elementary, a school he had once attended as a child. At approximately 9:35 a.m., he forced his way into the building. He was dressed in dark clothing and carrying weapons and ammunition. What followed unfolded with terrifying speed. Inside the school, teachers attempted to protect their students. Doors were locked. Children were hidden in corners, closets, and bathrooms. Staff members moved toward danger instead of away from it, trying to shield the young lives entrusted to them. Emergency calls began reaching police as officers rushed toward the campus. In only a matter of minutes, 20 children and 6 members of the school staff were killed. As law enforcement closed in, Lanza took his own life. By the time first responders reached the classrooms, the scale of the loss was almost impossible to comprehend. The investigation that followed was massive. Detectives searched the Lanza home, examined computers, reviewed digital records, and reconstructed his movements. They found thousands of files and extensive material related to previous shootings, but they did not find an accomplice, a conventional manifesto, or one simple motive capable of explaining the attack. Instead, the evidence revealed fragments: severe isolation, a fixation on mass violence, deteriorating human connection, and access to weapons legally purchased by his mother. Because Lanza died at the scene, there would be no arrest, no courtroom testimony, and no trial in which families could hear evidence presented before a jury. The legal aftermath therefore shifted toward responsibility, prevention, and the systems surrounding the attack. The ownership of the firearms intensified the national argument over gun laws. Questions about mental health care, family intervention, threat recognition, and school security became part of a conversation that extended far beyond Connecticut. Sandy Hook Promise and other advocacy efforts emerged with a mission to educate communities about warning signs and prevent future violence. The families also faced another cruelty. In the years after the attack, conspiracy theories falsely claimed the tragedy had been staged, causing survivors and grieving relatives to endure harassment. Civil cases later produced major judgments and settlements against those who amplified harmful misinformation. Separate litigation involving the firearm industry also resulted in a significant settlement, making the legal legacy of Sandy Hook unusual. Although the perpetrator could never be prosecuted, the families continued seeking accountability in other forms. The original school building was eventually demolished, and a new Sandy Hook Elementary School was built on the site. The decision was not meant to erase history. It was an attempt to create a place where children could learn without walking through the physical architecture of trauma. Memorials and annual remembrances continue to honor the victims, not as numbers in a national tragedy, but as children, educators, relatives, friends, and members of a community whose lives were permanently altered. Sandy Hook changed the American understanding of vulnerability. It forced the country to confront the possibility that even an elementary school could become a target, and that danger could grow quietly inside an ordinary home before erupting into public horror. There was no single cause and no easy explanation. What remained was a chain of isolation, obsession, missed opportunities, access, and irreversible loss. Newtown's story is therefore not only about what happened on one December morning, it is about what a community did afterward, turning grief into advocacy, memory into action, and the names of those lost into a continuing demand that innocence should never again be met with such violence. Number 2. Virginia Tech, Seung Hui Cho. April 16, 2007, began beneath a gray spring sky in Blacksburg, Virginia. Students crossed the Virginia Tech campus carrying books, coffee, and plans for the week ahead. Residence halls were waking up. Classrooms were filling. It felt like a normal Monday at a large university where thousands of people moved through separate routines, rarely imagining that danger could already be present among them. Within hours, 32 students and professors would be dead. Many more would be injured, and the university would become connected forever to one of the deadliest mass shootings in United States history. Seung Hui Cho was a 23-year-old senior studying English. Born in South Korea in 1984, he moved to the United States with his family when he was 8 years old. They settled in Virginia, where his parents worked long hours running a dry cleaning business and tried to build a stable life. From childhood, Cho was unusually quiet. Teachers observed that he struggled to speak in class and had difficulty forming social connections. His silence was not simply shyness, it appeared to be a barrier separating him from nearly everyone around him. By high school, counselors were aware that he suffered from severe anxiety and emotional problems. College, however, offered the possibility of a new beginning. At Virginia Tech, Cho lived in a dormitory and enrolled in writing courses, but his isolation followed him. Professors became disturbed by some of his work, which contained violent imagery and unsettling themes. Faculty members tried to intervene. He was referred for counseling and, at different points, came into contact with mental health services. Yet the separate pieces of concern were never assembled into one complete picture. Classmates often described him as nearly invisible. He avoided eye contact, spoke so quietly that people struggled to hear him, and sometimes refused to participate at all. He spent long stretches alone, nursing grievances that others could neither see nor understand. Several encounters with female students led to complaints about his behavior. In late 2005, after concerns about his mental condition, a court found that he presented a danger to himself and ordered outpatient treatment. That finding would later become central to questions about how he was still able to purchase firearms legally. The first violence occurred at approximately 7:15 a.m. inside West Ambler Johnston Hall. Cho entered the residence hall and killed 2 students. At first, police believed the incident might have been isolated and connected to a personal dispute. Officers began investigating while the university remained open. There was no clear suspect description and no immediate understanding that the person responsible was preparing for a second, much larger attack. Roughly 2 hours later, Cho arrived at Norris Hall. He entered the academic building and chained several exterior doors from the inside, trapping those within before moving through classrooms carrying firearms and a large supply of ammunition. Students and professors attempted to block doors with desks in their own bodies. Some escaped through windows. Others remained trapped as gunfire moved from room to room. The attack lasted only about 11 minutes, yet the terror inside Norris Hall seemed endless. When police finally breached the building, Cho took his own life. 32 victims had been killed, and numerous others were wounded. Investigators soon learned that the attack had been planned in advance. Cho had purchased his weapons despite his earlier mental health history because critical information had not been properly transmitted into the background check system. The gap exposed a serious failure between courts, health records, state reporting procedures, and federal firearm databases. A warning existed, but it had not reached the place where it might have changed the outcome. Between the first and second attacks, Cho mailed a package to a major television network. It contained photographs, video recordings, and a manifesto-like statement in which he portrayed himself as persecuted and justified his violence through imagined grievances. When portions of the material were broadcast, the decision triggered outrage. Families and media critics argued that the coverage gave Cho the attention he had sought and risked turning the perpetrator into the central figure instead of the victims. The controversy became an early and important debate about how news organizations should report mass violence without rewarding the desire for notoriety. With Cho dead, the legal consequences focused on institutional responsibility. Families accused Virginia Tech of failing to warn the campus quickly enough after the first killings. The state later reached a settlement with many of the victims' families, and the university faced years of litigation and scrutiny over its emergency response. Across the country, colleges reassessed alert systems, lockdown procedures, threat assessment teams, and the handling of students showing signs of serious distress. The case also helped drive reforms in mental health reporting for firearm background checks. Yet the deeper lesson was more complicated than simply identifying one missed record. Professors had seen disturbing writing. Counselors had encountered him. Students had complained about troubling behavior. A court had documented concerns. Each warning existed in a different place, held by different people under rules designed to protect privacy and limit overreaction. No single person understood the full danger until the attack had already begun. Virginia Tech responded by honoring those who were lost. Memorial stones were placed on campus, scholarships were created, and each April the community gathers in remembrance. The university became known not only for the violence it endured, but for the solidarity that followed. Students, faculty, families, first responders, and survivors built a public identity around the phrase, "We are Virginia Tech," refusing to allow the attackers' actions to define the institution completely. The story of Seung-Hui Cho remains a study in isolation, grievance, system failure, and the danger of warning signs scattered across institutions that do not communicate. His silence concealed a storm, but the tragedy was not caused by silence alone. It emerged where untreated distress, personal rage, procedural gaps, and access to weapons converged. Virginia Tech changed how campuses prepare for emergencies and how the country discusses mental health and public safety. Above all, it remains a place of remembrance for 32 people who entered classrooms expecting to learn and never returned home. Number 3. Marjory Stoneman. Douglas High School, Nicholas Cruz. February 14, 2018 was supposed to be filled with cards, flowers, and teenage excitement. At Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, students moved through the final hours of the school day thinking about Valentine's plans and the long weekend ahead. Then, at approximately 2:19 p.m., an expelled former student entered the campus carrying a rifle. In less than 7 minutes, 17 people were killed and 17 others were wounded. Unlike many perpetrators in the most notorious school shootings, Nicholas Cruz survived, allowing the country to watch his case move from arrest to confession, trial, and final sentencing. Cruz was born in 1998 and adopted as an infant by Roger and Linda Cruz, who also adopted his younger brother. His early childhood appeared stable, but trouble emerged as he grew older. Teachers documented emotional outbursts, aggression, difficulty following rules, and repeated disciplinary problems. His adoptive father died when Cruz was 6, leaving Linda to manage 2 boys while navigating her older son's increasingly complex needs. Cruz moved through special education programs and multiple schools. He received counseling and behavioral support, but the pattern continued. He could be withdrawn one moment and explosive the next. Classmates remembered an obsession with weapons, violent images, and killing animals. His social media activity contained threatening statements and photographs of firearms. Law enforcement had been called to the family home repeatedly, and people close to him had raised concerns that he might eventually hurt himself or someone else. In 2017, Cruz was expelled from Marjory Stoneman Douglas after continuing disciplinary incidents. That same year, while still legally able to do so, he purchased the semi-automatic rifle later used in the attack. His life became even less stable after Linda died in November 2017. Cruz moved between homes carrying his anger, grief, and access to weapons with him. On the afternoon of the shooting, Cruz arrived near the school in a rideshare vehicle with the rifle concealed in a bag. He entered through an unsecured gate and walked toward Building 12, a 3-story classroom building used largely by freshmen. Once inside, he began firing into classrooms and hallways. Teachers locked doors and pulled students out of sight. Some students recorded desperate messages to their families. Others tried to escape as smoke from a fire alarm created additional confusion. The violence ended almost as quickly as it began. Cruz abandoned his rifle and equipment, left the building, and blended into the wave of students fleeing the campus. He walked to nearby businesses, bought a drink, and continued moving through the community while police searched for him. Less than 2 hours later, an officer spotted him and made the arrest without resistance. The investigation revealed a trail of warnings that had never produced a decisive intervention. The FBI acknowledged that it had received information about alarming online comments, but failed to act properly. Local authorities had responded to numerous calls involving Cruz. School officials, counselors, relatives, and acquaintances had all encountered pieces of the same disturbing picture. Yet none of those contacts prevented him from buying a firearm or returning to the school. Cruz was charged with 17 counts of murder and 17 counts of attempted murder. His attorneys offered an early guilty plea if prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty, but the state refused. After years of delays, Cruz pleaded guilty in 2021, leaving a jury to decide whether he would be executed or spend the rest of his life in prison. The penalty trial began in 2022. Survivors described the attack in painful detail. Prosecutors presented evidence of planning, internet searches, videos, and Cruz's movements through the building. The defense did not dispute what he had done. Instead, it focused on his lifelong emotional and developmental problems, family history, and exposure to alcohol before birth. For a death sentence, Florida law at the time required a unanimous jury recommendation. The jury did not reach unanimity, and Cruz received life imprisonment without parole. The decision angered many victims' relatives, some of whom had expected death sentences after hearing months of evidence. In November 2022, before imposing 34 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, the court allowed families and survivors to address Cruz directly. Their statements transformed the courtroom into a final public record of the lives lost and the damage carried by those who survived. Parkland's influence extended far beyond the trial. Students who survived organized March for Our Lives, turning personal trauma into one of the most visible youth-led gun reform movements in the country. Florida enacted a package of changes that included raising the minimum age for certain firearm purchases and expanding tools for temporarily removing guns from people considered dangerous. Across the United States, schools revisited threat assessment, emergency communication, campus access, and the responsibility to act when warnings accumulate. Marjory Stoneman Douglas also became a story of institutional failure. The attack exposed breakdowns involving law enforcement response, federal tip handling, school discipline, mental health intervention, and firearm access. No single missed sign explains what happened. Together, however, they formed a chain of opportunities that failed to stop a known threat. The name Parkland now carries two meanings. It represents 17 lives taken in a place built for learning, but it also represents survivors who refused to disappear into grief. Their activism ensured that the tragedy entered not only the history of true crime, but the history of American political organizing. Cruz will spend the rest of his life behind bars. The victims' families will carry a sentence of their own, one measured not in years, but in every birthday, graduation, and ordinary family moment that will never come. Number 4, Robb Elementary School, Salvador Ramos. On May 24, 2022, Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas, was approaching the end of the academic year. Classrooms were decorated with student work. Teachers were preparing children for summer. Families expected the day to end with the usual pickup lines and stories from school. Instead, a gunman entered adjoining fourth-grade classrooms and killed 19 children and 2 teachers. The attack was devastating, but the response that followed would make Uvalde one of the most examined and criticized law enforcement failures in modern American history. Salvador Ramos was 18 years old. Born in North Dakota and raised in Uvalde, he was described as increasingly withdrawn and disconnected. He struggled at school, experienced conflict at home, and eventually dropped out before graduating. Former classmates remembered bullying, arguments, and changes in his behavior. He worked briefly at a fast food restaurant where colleagues saw a young man who rarely spoke and appeared separated from those around him. Online, Ramos created a different presence. He posted photographs of firearms, made aggressive comments, and sent disturbing messages to other users. Some people saw the behavior as attention-seeking. Others recognized something more threatening but did not know how to intervene. He had no serious criminal record and no documented diagnosis that legally prevented him from purchasing weapons. Within days of turning 18, Ramos legally bought 2 AR-style rifles and a large quantity of ammunition. The purchases were lawful, but the speed and scale of them would later raise questions about whether retailers, online platforms, or background systems should have triggered additional scrutiny for such a young buyer. The violence began at home. On the morning of May 24th, Ramos shot his grandmother after an argument. She survived and sought help. Ramos then took her truck and drove toward Robb Elementary, crashing it near the school shortly before 11:30 a.m. Witnesses saw him leave the vehicle carrying a rifle. Calls began reaching emergency services as he moved toward the campus. He entered the school at approximately 11:33 a.m. and made his way into 2 connected classrooms filled with 4th-grade students and their teachers. Officers arrived within minutes and initially moved toward the gunfire, but after being fired upon, they retreated into the hallway. What should have remained an immediate active shooter response slowly became treated as though the gunmen were barricaded and contained. For more than an hour, heavily armed officers gathered in and around the school. Some searched for keys, others waited for equipment, shields, or instructions. Command was fragmented, communication was poor, and no one effectively took control. Meanwhile, children trapped inside called 911, whispering for police and reporting that people were still alive. Parents gathered outside, pleading with officers to enter. Some attempted to reach the building themselves and were restrained. At approximately 12:50 p.m., a tactical team finally entered the classrooms and killed Ramos. By then, a total of 21 victims, including 19 4th-grade children and teachers, Irma Garcia and Eva Mireles, had lost their lives. The delay became nearly as central to the national discussion as the shooter himself. Early official statements gave inaccurate accounts of the response, further damaging trust between authorities and the community. Because Ramos died during the confrontation, there was no criminal trial. Accountability shifted toward the agencies and officials responsible for school security and emergency response. Investigations documented failures in leadership, training, communication, and decision-making. Nearly 400 officers from multiple agencies had responded, yet the presence of overwhelming manpower did not produce immediate action. The central lesson was brutal. Equipment and personnel are meaningless when command collapses and trained responders hesitate during the moment they are needed most. Ramos's background also raised familiar questions. His isolation, online threats, fascination with firearms, and sudden purchases appeared alarming in retrospect, but none led to intervention before the attack. The case again demonstrated how threatening behavior can remain scattered across families, schools, websites, acquaintances, retailers, and law enforcement without any one system seeing the full picture. Uvalde transformed grief into political pressure. Families demanded answers, public records, resignations, stronger firearm laws, and accountability for officers who waited. At the federal level, Congress passed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act in June 2022. The law expanded background check procedures for buyers under 21, increased support for mental health and school safety, and strengthened measures involving gun trafficking and dangerous individuals. The Robb Elementary campus became covered in flowers, photographs, toys, and handwritten messages sent from around the world. Plans were made to replace the building, not because a new structure could remove the pain, but because asking children to return to the same physical space carried a burden no renovation could fully solve. Uvalde changed the true crime history of school shootings because it became 2 tragedies at once. The first was the act committed by an 18-year-old gunman. The second was the prolonged failure of trained officers to confront him. The case forced the country to ask not only how a young man acquired the means to attack a school, but what the promise of protection means when those assigned to respond do not move. For the families, every delayed minute remains part of the story. For the nation, Uvalde is now a warning that preparation must be more than policies, drills, equipment, and words. It must become action when the classroom door is still closed and lives may still be saved. Number 5. Columbine High School, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. April 20th, 1999, altered the way an entire generation understood school violence. Columbine High School stood in a quiet suburban community near Littleton, Colorado, a place that appeared distant from the kinds of danger associated with crime headlines. By the end of the day, 12 students and 1 teacher had been killed, More than 20 others were injured, and 2 teenage perpetrators had created a blueprint of notoriety that would influence media coverage, police tactics, school security, and later attackers for decades. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold were seniors at Columbine. Harris, born in 1981, grew up in a military family and moved frequently before settling in Colorado. He was intelligent, technically skilled, and interested in computers, games, and creating online content. Klebold, born in Colorado in 1981, came from an educated family and was remembered as quieter, more awkward, and deeply self-conscious. The two became friends in middle school and gradually formed a closed partnership built around resentment, private fantasy, and contempt for others. Public explanations initially portrayed them as bullied members of a school outcast group. The truth was more complicated. They did experience alienation and humiliation, but their writings showed that the attack was not simply an impulsive response to bullying. Harris expressed grandiosity, hatred, and a desire for domination. Klebold wrote about depression, rejection, and suicide. Their personalities were different, but together they reinforced each other. Harris supplied aggression and control, while Klebold brought despair and a willingness to die. In 1998, they were arrested after breaking into a van and stealing equipment. Both entered a diversion program, completed assignments, and convinced adults that they had accepted responsibility. Harris even wrote an apology that appeared sincere. Behind that performance, however, they continued planning mass violence. For more than a year, they acquired firearms, constructed explosives, studied the school, and recorded private videos discussing their intentions. Their plan was far more destructive than the shooting that ultimately occurred. They placed propane bombs inside the cafeteria, expecting explosions to kill hundreds of students and collapse part of the building. They intended to shoot survivors fleeing outside and had additional explosives in their vehicles. But shortly before lunchtime on April 20th, the cafeteria bombs failed. At approximately 11:19 a.m., Harris and Klebold began shooting outside the school. They then entered the building and moved through hallways toward the library, where many students were hiding beneath tables. The attack became a nightmare of gunfire, explosions, smoke, alarms, and uncertainty. Teacher Dave Sanders was shot while helping students escape and later died before medical teams reached him. Inside the library, 10 students were killed. Police surrounded the school, but the law enforcement doctrine of the era emphasized containing the scene and waiting for specialized tactical units. Officers exchanged fire with the attackers but did not immediately move through the building. Harris and Klebold eventually returned to the library and took their own lives. Nearly an hour had passed since the first shots. The investigation uncovered journals, websites, videos, weapon purchases, explosive materials, and repeated warning signs. Harris had posted threats online. A search warrant affidavit had once been prepared after a complaint, but was never executed. School assignments contained violent themes. Friends had seen weapons and bomb-making activity. The 1998 arrest offered another moment when deeper scrutiny might have exposed the plan, yet each sign remained isolated, minimized, or undiscovered. Columbine transformed police tactics. Agencies moved away from waiting outside during active attacks and began training the first officers on scene to enter quickly and move toward the gunfire. Schools introduced lockdown drills, threat assessment practices, surveillance, controlled entrances, and school resource officers. The attack also changed journalism. Saturation coverage made Harris and Klebold internationally recognizable, helping inspire later perpetrators who studied Columbine and sought similar attention. That legacy is one reason responsible retellings must resist turning the attackers into anti-heroes. They were not misunderstood masterminds or symbols of rebellion. Their original bombing plan failed, yet the violence they carried out destroyed families and created a cultural script that others attempted to imitate. The most important names are those of the 13 victims and the survivors who carried the trauma forward. A memorial near the school now honors those who were killed. Each anniversary returns the community to a day that never fully ended, while also demonstrating decades of endurance. Columbine remains a dividing line in American history. Before it, school shootings seemed rare and almost unthinkable. After it, schools across the country began preparing children for the possibility. The partnership between Harris and Klebold shows how two different forms of darkness can combine. One was driven by rage and superiority, the other by depression and self-destruction. Separately, their fantasies might never have become action. Together, they created a plan intended to surpass every previous school attack. Columbine's lasting lesson is not that every isolated teenager is dangerous. It is that specific threats, weapon access, violent planning, and escalating behavior must be recognized for what they are. More than a quarter century later, the school's name remains a warning about missed intervention, contagious notoriety, and the terrible price paid when fantasy is allowed to become preparation. If you would like to see more of these well-researched true crime stories, take a moment to like and subscribe to The Night Hour and join the exclusive 2% of viewers who keep these deep dives alive. Number 6. Santa Fe High School, Dimitrios Pagortzis. May 18, 2018 began as a quiet Friday morning in Santa Fe, Texas. Students entered Santa Fe High School, found their friends, and settled into first-period classes. Nothing about the routine suggested that within minutes, an art classroom would become the center of one of the deadliest school shootings in Texas history. Dimitrios Pagortzis was 17 years old and a junior at the school. Classmates and teachers generally remembered him as quiet, reserved, and outwardly respectful. He played football and participated in activities connected to his family's Greek Orthodox church. He was not widely known as a violent student, which made the attack especially difficult for the community to understand. Afterward, however, investigators uncovered signs of a darker private world. Pagortzis had expressed fascination with death, rebellion, and violent imagery. He wrote personal notes about the attack and obtained a shotgun and revolver from his family home. Both firearms were legally owned by his father. He also assembled crude explosive devices, suggesting that the violence was planned rather than spontaneous. Shortly before 7:30 a.m., Pagortzis entered an art classroom wearing a black trench coat despite the warm weather. The coat concealed the weapons. Without warning, he opened fire. Students dropped to the floor, hid in supply rooms, or escaped through exits while teachers attempted to protect them. The attack expanded into a prolonged confrontation as law enforcement officers arrived and exchanged gunfire with him. The violence lasted far longer than many school attacks. After roughly half an hour, Pagortzis surrendered. According to investigators, he later said he had intended to die but could not bring himself to take his own life. 10 people, 8 students, and 2 teachers were killed, and 13 others were wounded. Police searching the campus found homemade explosive devices, including pipe bombs and pressure cooker devices, though none detonated. Investigators also examined writings that indicated preparation and a desire to be remembered. Pagortzis reportedly told authorities that he deliberately spared certain students he liked, a statement that brought no explanation or comfort to families trying to understand why anyone had been selected at all. He was charged with capital murder and aggravated assault on a public servant. Yet the prosecution did not move toward trial. Mental health experts repeatedly found him incompetent to stand trial, meaning he could not adequately understand the proceedings or assist in his defense. He was committed to a state psychiatric hospital for treatment and periodic evaluation. By 2026, the criminal case remained stalled because his competency had not been restored. That unresolved legal status created a different kind of pain for Santa Fe. However, a landmark civil trial in August 2024 finally brought massive evidence to light. Though a Texas jury found the shooter's parents not liable for the attack, the emotional proceedings exposed severe, unchecked warning signs in the household. Still, the criminal courtroom reckoning did not arrive. The shooting renewed arguments about safe firearm storage, school security, and how communities identify students in serious emotional crisis. Families pursued civil claims, and survivors became advocates for prevention. The school returned to classes, but returning to a building is not the same as returning to the life that existed before the attack. Memorials, scholarships, and community events now honor the 10 victims. For students who survived, ordinary sounds, a fire alarm, a slammed door, footsteps in a hallway, could carry them back to that morning. Santa Fe's story remains unfinished in the legal sense, but its central truth is already clear. A student who appeared quiet and manageable had privately moved from dark thought to preparation. The tragedy exposed how difficult it can be to recognize danger when warning signs remain hidden until the first shot is fired. Number 7. Oxford High School, Ethan Crumbley. On November 30th, 2021, students at Oxford High School in Michigan moved through a normal Tuesday, already looking toward winter break. The halls were crowded between classes, teachers continued their lessons, and lockers slammed with the familiar rhythm of an ordinary school day. But behind that routine, administrators had already met with a 15-year-old student and his parents about a disturbing drawing. Hours later, that same student opened fire in the hallway. Ethan Crumbley was a sophomore who often blended into the background. Teachers described him as quiet and capable, but his emotional condition had been deteriorating. In the days before the attack, staff members discovered him searching for ammunition on his phone during class. When the school contacted his mother, she responded privately to her son rather than expressing alarm to administrators. The warning became more serious on the morning of November 30th. A teacher found a worksheet containing drawings of a firearm, a wounded person, and written statements suggesting despair and violence. Ethan was taken to the office, and his parents, James and Jennifer Crumbley, were summoned. School counselors urged them to obtain immediate mental health support and asked them to take him home. They declined, and Ethan returned to class. No one searched his backpack. No one knew that the handgun his father had bought only days earlier was inside it. At approximately 12:51 p.m., Ethan entered a restroom and emerged carrying the 9mm pistol. He began firing in a hallway as students and teachers ran for classrooms. Doors were barricaded, announcements warned of danger, and terrified students sent messages to their families. The attack lasted only minutes. 4 students, Tate Meyer, Hannah Street Juliana, Madison Baldwin, and Justin Schilling, were killed. 6 other students and a teacher were wounded before deputies confronted Ethan and took him into custody. Investigators quickly focused not only on the shooter, but on his parents. The firearm had been purchased during the Thanksgiving weekend and had been presented to Ethan as accessible property rather than treated as a secured adult weapon. Social media posts celebrated the purchase. Prosecutors argued that the parents knew their son was struggling, ignored clear warnings, failed to disclose the gun during the school meeting, and did not safely secure it. Ethan was charged with murder, terrorism causing death, and other offenses. He pleaded guilty in 2022. Because he was a juvenile, the court held an extensive hearing before deciding whether life without parole was constitutionally appropriate. In December 2023, the judge imposed that sentence, concluding that the attack was planned and that the devastation demanded the harshest available punishment. The prosecution of James and Jennifer Crumbley made the case historically significant. They were tried separately and convicted of involuntary manslaughter, becoming the first parents in the United States convicted of homicide for their role in a mass school shooting committed by their child. Each received a prison sentence of 10 to 15 years with a mandatory minimum of 10 years served before parole eligibility. Those convictions did not mean the parents had pulled the trigger. The state's argument was that their gross negligence helped make the attack possible. The verdicts expanded the legal discussion surrounding parental responsibility, firearm storage, and what adults must do when a child displays a combination of emotional collapse, violent imagery, and immediate access to a gun. Oxford also exposed failures inside the school. Staff members recognized the drawings as disturbing, but Ethan remained on campus. His belongings were not searched, and the parents were permitted to leave without removing him. The case became a study in how multiple adults can observe the same danger yet underestimate what it means. The community continues to honor the 4 students through memorials, scholarships, and acts of service. Survivors have spoken about the courage of teachers, classmates, and first responders, but bravery after gunfire cannot replace prevention before it. Oxford changed true crime history because accountability moved beyond the teenage shooter. For the first time, a jury held parents criminally responsible for ignoring a chain of warnings connected to a weapon they had provided. The result left the country with a difficult question. When adults see the danger forming and possess the power to interrupt it, how much responsibility do they carry when they choose not to act? Number 8. Marshall County High School, Gabriel Parker. January 23, 2018 was a freezing Tuesday morning in Benton, Kentucky. Before the first bell at Marshall County High School, students gathered in the Commons area, talking with friends and waiting for the day to begin. It was the most crowded part of the morning, and 15-year-old Gabriel Parker knew it. Parker was an academically strong student with no serious disciplinary history. Teachers described him as polite, intelligent, and quiet. He came from a stable home and showed interest in science and technology. He did not fit the public stereotype of a teenager already known for violence. Yet privately, he had begun writing about chaos, death, and the experience of killing. That morning, Parker carried a .22 caliber handgun from home inside his backpack. At approximately 7:57 a.m., he entered the crowded atrium, drew the weapon, and fired into the group of students. Panic moved through the school instantly. Teenagers ran through exits, climbed over furniture, and rushed into classrooms, while teachers attempted to lock doors and shelter those nearby. The attack lasted less than 2 minutes. Bailey Holt and Preston Cope, both 15, were killed. 14 other students suffered gunshot wounds and additional students were injured while escaping. Parker left the immediate scene and attempted to move away with the crowd, but law enforcement officers quickly took him into custody. The small community of Benton struggled to reconcile the violence with the teenager they thought they knew. There had been no long record of suspensions, public threats, or aggressive confrontations. During questioning, Parker admitted planning the attack. Investigators recovered writings that described his desire to create panic and experience what it would feel like to take a life. The absence of a simple grievance made the case even more disturbing. There was no clear history of severe bullying or abuse that could explain his choice, only deliberate preparation and an emotionally detached curiosity about violence. Prosecutors charged Parker as an adult with 2 counts of murder and multiple counts of first-degree assault. His attorneys raised his age and mental condition, arguing that a 15-year-old could not fully understand the permanent consequences of such an act, but the prosecution emphasized his planning, the decision to bring the gun, and the choice of a crowded location. In 2020, Parker pleaded guilty. He received life imprisonment for the murders and additional prison terms for the assaults. Under the sentence, he became eligible for parole after 20 years, though eligibility does not guarantee release. For victims' families, the hearing offered a courtroom conclusion but not peace. They described children whose futures had been reduced to photographs and memories. Survivors spoke about injuries, fear, and the moment an ordinary morning became divided into everything before the shooting and everything after it. Marshall County expanded threat detection training and strengthened school security. The community created memorials and scholarships for Bailey and Preston, choosing to define them by their lives rather than by the attack that ended them. Parker remains a chilling example of how violence can develop without the warning signs people expect to see. He was not publicly explosive. He was not repeatedly arrested or suspended. He was a quiet student who concealed a plan until he entered a crowded room and carried it out. Marshall County's lesson is therefore one of uncertainty. Prevention requires attention not only to loud threats, but also to private writings, sudden changes, weapon access, and the possibility that the most dangerous decision may be forming behind an outwardly calm face. Number 9, Marysville Pilchuck High School, Jalen Freiberg. October 24, 2014 was a bright Friday morning at Marysville Pilchuck High School in Washington State. Homecoming season had filled the campus with school spirit, football talk, and weekend plans. In the cafeteria, students gathered for lunch with no reason to fear the popular freshman who had invited several close friends to sit together at one table. Jalen Freiberg was 15 years old, a football player, wrestler, and recently selected homecoming prince. He came from a prominent Tulalip tribal family and was widely described as friendly, confident, and well-liked. His case immediately challenged the familiar image of a school shooter as a rejected outsider. Jalen had friends, status, family ties, and a place within his community. But in the days before the attack, his emotional state had changed. He had experienced conflict involving a romantic relationship and close friendships. His social media posts became increasingly bitter and despairing, suggesting that beneath his public confidence he felt betrayed and unable to control the pain. On the morning of the shooting, Jalen contacted several people he knew well and encouraged them to meet him for lunch. At approximately 10:39 a.m., they gathered in the cafeteria. Jalen approached the table carrying a .40 caliber handgun taken from his father's home. Without warning, he opened fire on the friends and relatives seated in front of him. The attack lasted only seconds. A cafeteria worker attempted to intervene. Jalen then took his own life. 5 students had been shot. Zoe Galasso died at the scene, while Gia Soriano, Shaylee Chuckelnaskett, and Andrew Freiberg died from their injuries in the following days and weeks. Nate Hatch survived after being seriously wounded. The identities of the victims made the tragedy especially painful. These were not strangers selected at random. They were Jalen's friends, cousins, and members of the same extended tribal community. Families were forced to grieve across lines that normally provided support. The community mourned the victims while also confronting the fact that the perpetrator was a child many of them had loved. Investigators found no extremist ideology or elaborate plan for mass destruction. The evidence pointed instead toward personal conflict, emotional collapse, and a decision made with a firearm that was immediately available. Jalen had sent messages shortly before the attack expressing love for his family and apologizing for what he intended to do. Those messages showed awareness, but they did not provide an explanation capable of making the violence understandable. The gun had been purchased by Jalen's father, Raymond Freiberg, who was legally prohibited from possessing firearms because of a domestic violence protection order. He was later convicted of federal firearm offenses and sentenced to prison. That prosecution placed the case within a broader discussion about background check failures, illegal possession, and safe storage inside homes with teenagers. Marysville and the Tulalip tribes responded together. Vigils included tribal prayers, songs, and ceremonies. The words, "We are Marysville, we are Tulalip," became a statement of unity. Counseling centers supported students and families, while the cafeteria was later redesigned so future students would not have to eat every day inside a room permanently associated with death. Jalen Freiberg's case remains one of the most heartbreaking examples of violence directed inward at a trusted social circle. He was not attacking unknown classmates or an institution he hated. He invited people he loved to a table and transformed their closeness into vulnerability. Marysville changed the conversation by showing that popularity does not guarantee emotional stability and that visible success can conceal private despair. The tragedy left a warning that pain can remain hidden behind smiles, celebrations, and social status, and that when firearms are accessible, a brief emotional collapse can create consequences no family or community can ever reverse. Number 10. Red Lake Senior High School, Jeff Weiss. On March 21, 2005, snow covered the Red Lake Indian Reservation in northern Minnesota. Red Lake. Senior high school served a small, close-knit community where students shared family ties, cultural traditions, and generations of history. That Monday afternoon, a 16-year-old student carried violence from his grandfather's home into the school, killing people from the very community that had raised him. Jeff Weiss had lived through severe instability long before the attack. His father died by suicide when Jeff was young. His mother later suffered catastrophic injuries in a car crash and required long-term care. Jeff was raised largely by his grandfather, Darrell Lussier, a respected tribal police officer. Yet the security of that home could not erase the losses surrounding him. At school, Weiss was withdrawn and frequently absent. He experienced bullying and became increasingly isolated from his peers. Online, however, he expressed himself through dark drawings, violent stories, and messages filled with hopelessness and anger. He showed fascination with previous mass shootings and created imagery that seemed to turn his pain into fantasy. He had also struggled with suicidal thoughts and received treatment, including antidepressant medication. On the afternoon of March 21st, Weiss went to his grandfather's home. He killed Darrell Lussier and Lussier's companion, Michelle Sagana. He then took his grandfather's police weapons, body armor, and patrol vehicle and drove to Red Lake Senior High School. At approximately 2:45 p.m., he arrived at the entrance and shot security guard Derek Brune, who attempted to stop him. Weiss entered the building and moved through hallways and classrooms as teachers locked doors and students hid. He killed security guard Derek Brune at the entrance and went on to kill teacher Neva Rogers and 5 students inside classrooms before police confronted him. After exchanging gunfire with an officer, Weiss retreated into a classroom and took his own life. 10 people died in total, including Weiss. Several others were wounded. At the time, it was one of the deadliest school shootings in United States history, yet its location on a remote Native American reservation meant that the surrounding social conditions were often less examined than the perpetrator's online activity. The investigation found no active accomplice who helped carry out the attack. Instead, authorities focused on Weiss's personal trauma, depression, isolation, suicidal thinking, fascination with violence, and access to his grandfather's law enforcement weapons. The warning signs existed, but Red Lake also faced limited mental health resources and the wider pressures experienced by many tribal communities, including poverty, grief, addiction, and inadequate access to care. Federal and tribal authorities worked together because the attack occurred on sovereign tribal land. With Weiss dead, there was no trial. The community's attention turned toward healing, prevention, and the painful task of burying people whose families were closely connected. Tribal leaders emphasized ceremony, cultural strength, and collective mourning. Counseling services were expanded, the school was renovated, and annual remembrances honored the victims. Red Lake's recovery did not follow the same public path as other high-profile school tragedies. The reservation's traditions shaped how grief was expressed and how the community understood responsibility. Elders encouraged young people to speak about pain rather than carry it alone. The response acknowledged that violence cannot be separated from the emotional and social conditions in which a child grows. Jeff Weiss's story is not an excuse for what he did. It is a warning about accumulated trauma that receives too little care, isolation that deepens online, and despair that becomes attached to violent fantasy. Red Lake changed true crime history by demonstrating that school shootings were not limited to suburbs, large cities, or any single social group. They could reach a remote reservation where resources were scarce and every victim's name was connected to another family. The scars remain, but so does Red Lake's determination to endure. The final legacy belongs not to the teenager who carried weapons into the school, but to the community that refused to be defined by him. Through remembrance, cultural identity, and demands for better support, the Red Lake Nation turned an act of destruction into a continuing promise. No young person's suffering should remain invisible until it becomes everyone's tragedy.